Imagine standing in the center of an historic theater. The house lights are down, the crowd has long since gone home, and the air carries the faint, sweet scent of cigar smoke. But you are entirely alone, or at least you're supposed to be. Tonight, we're going into a venue that has hosted everyone from Gilded Age opera singers to the roaring, distorted guitars of the 90s grunge revolution. But beneath the velvet seats and glamorous architecture of Seattle's Moore Theater lies a foundation built on displaced graves, tragic accidents, and spirits that refuse to take their final bow. Grab your tickets, listeners. The show is about to begin. To understand the ghosts of the Moore Theater, you have to understand the space they inhabit. If you were to walk into the venue on a Tuesday afternoon when the stage is dark, the first thing that strikes you is the sheer scale. Your eyes are immediately drawn upward to a massive stained glass dome embedded in the ceiling, filtering whatever gray Seattle light manages to punch through the roof. You walk down the center aisle of the orchestra pit. The seats are deep velvet red, fixed to cast iron frames that have been bolted to the floorboards for generations. It feels grand, but as you get closer to the stage, the air changes. It gets heavier, cooler. You step onto the stage itself. Look out. The auditorium rises up in a steep, dizzying tiers. The second balcony, often called the cheap seats back in the day, is pitched at such a sharp angle it feels like it's looming over you. It's dark up there. Even with the work lights on, the shadows seem to pool in the back rows. Now let's step backstage. The glamour immediately evaporates. It's a maze of cold, concrete, exposed brick. The winding iron staircases. If you look up into the fly loft, the massive vertical space above the stage where curtains and backdrops are hoisted, you see a web of ropes, cables, and wooden catwalks suspended 80 feet in the air. This is where the crew works. It's also where the atmosphere shifts from historic charm to distinct isolated dread. Down beneath the stage, the dressing rooms are small, claustrophobic, and subterranean. You are literally standing below street level, surrounded by foundations that have held up this block since the city was rebuilding itself from ash. And it's down here, in the dark, where their history starts to catch up with you. The year is 1907. Seattle is booming. The Klondike Gold Rush has flooded the city with sudden, explosive wealth. And a developer named James A. Moore decided the city needs a cultural crown jewel. He sets his sights on the corner of 2nd Avenue and Virginia Street. He doesn't want a theater. He wants an opulent statement, lavish lounges, a hotel attached next door, and a playing grand stage for the finest traveling acts in the world. But James Moore had a problem. Seattle's topography was a chaotic mess of steep hills, mud, and poorly planned infrastructure. To build his empire, he had to reshape the land, and that meant dealing with what came before. In the late 19th century, the area around Denny Hill housed one of Seattle's earliest burial sites, the Washelli Cemetery. As the city expanded, dead bodies became inconvenient real estate. The city ordered the cemetery to be cleared, relocating the remains north to what is now Evergreen Washelli Cemetery. But here is the grim reality of the 1800s. Record keeping and mass exhumation, it was deeply flawed. Relocation crews were paid by the coffin, working quickly against city development deadlines. Wooden markers had rotted away. Family plots had been forgotten. Historians and urban legends alike agree that when the steam shovels came through to flatten Denny Hill and dig the foundation for the Moore Theater, they weren't just moving dirt, they were digging through a forgotten, compromised graveyard. Local lore says that only the graves with headstones still standing were moved. The rest, the unmarked, the poor, the forgotten, they were paved over, left behind. For over a century, thousands of people have sat in the audience of the Moor, completely unaware of that they were laughing, cheering, and applauding directly over a site of massive spiritual desecration. But the Moor Theater's history didn't stop when the Gilded Age opera singers packed up their trunks. Decades later, this grand decaying room became the epicenter of a musical revolution. If the displaced graves beneath the floorboards laid the foundation for the hauntings, the 1990s grunge movement acted as a massive high-voltage battery that woke everything up. Before they were selling out global arenas, icons like Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Mudhoney played the Moor. In June of 1989, Sub Pop Records hosted the infamous Lame Fest right here. It was a chaotic, legendary night. A young Kurt Cobain was smashing his guitar and diving into the drum kit on this very stage, while the crowd rioted so hard against security that the bands had to stop playing. There's an incredible amount of raw, volatile, human emotion poured into a space during a show like that, and the Moor kept absorbing it. In 1990, Alice in Chains took the stage to film their iconic live facelift concert. If you watch that footage today, you can feel the oppressive, heavy energy in the room. Lane Staley's haunting vocals bounced off the exact same balcony where James Moore's spirit allegedly sits. 2 years later, Pearl Jam filmed their legendary Even Flow music video here. Eddie Vedder famously climbed the theater's architectural molding and leapt leaping blindly into the crowd. And in 1995, the grunge supergroup Mad Season played one of their final, most emotional shows here, immortalized as Live at the Moor. Paranormal investigators often talk about the stone tape theory, the idea that building materials like brick, wood, and iron can record intense emotional energy like a cassette tape. For over a decade, the Moor was blasted with thousands of decibels of distorted sound, packed with thousands of sweating, screaming, emotionally charged youth. When you pump that much lightning into an old building built on a cemetery, the curtain between the living and the dead doesn't just thin, it tears completely open. And as any student of the paranormal knows, when you disturb the resting places of the dead and recharge them with that kind of energy, they tend to make themselves known to the living. When a building is constructed over a disrupted cemetery, paranormal activity isn't just a possibility, it's an expectation. But at the Moor Theater, the hauntings aren't vague shadows or bumps in the night. They are specific, repetitive, and deeply woven into the daily operations of the venue. Let's start in the balcony, specifically the second tier. This is the domain of the theater's most famous and perhaps most stubborn entity, James A. Moore himself. For decades, patrons, cleaners, and security guards have reported a bizarre, localized phenomenon. You can be walking through the empty, drafty upper rows after a show, and suddenly you are hit by a wall of thick, pungent, freshly lit cigar smoke. Now, a skeptic would say, it's an old theater, someone snuck a smoke during the encore, but the theater staff tracked it. Scent doesn't drift. It doesn't dissipate with the heavy-duty HVAC system. It anchors itself to one specific area, seat 22. During a routine renovation, the theater actually replaced the fabric and padding of that exact chair, thinking the scent was trapped in the antique textiles. The very next night, a night custodian walked into the empty row. The smell of premium tobacco was so thick it made his eyes water. James Moore spent his life overseeing every detail of this building, and local lore says he still takes his seat, watching the stage from the shadows, enjoying a smoke a century after his death. But Moore isn't alone in the upper decks. Multiple concert goers, people who came to the Moore with zero knowledge of its ghost stories, have approached security during packed, high-energy rock shows to complain about an actor or an eccentric guest. They report seeing a woman dressed in incredibly heavy, pristine 19th century Victorian clothing. She wears a long, dark dress, a bonnet, and moves with stiff, deliberate pace through the crowded corridors. The terrifying part, witnesses watch her walk into areas that are completely dead ends, like blocked off construction zones or solid brick walls, and simply cease to exist. Because her clothing predates the 1907 construction of the theater, paranormal investigators believe she isn't a ghost of the venue at all. She is one of the displaced souls from the Washelli Cemetery, wandering the upper tiers, looking for the grave plot that was stolen from her. If the balcony belongs to the patrons, the backstage belongs to Stagehand Sam. Ask any audio engineer or roadie who has traveled through Seattle, and they will tell you the Moore's backstage has an oppressive energy. Sam is believed to be a theater technician from the 1930s who lost his life in a horrific rigging accident, plunging from the fly lofts to the hardwood stage below. Today, Sam acts as a classic poltergeist. Touring bands have left their guitars perfectly tuned on stands, only to return minutes later to find every string violently detuned. Heavy sandbags used to balance the stage curtains have been swinging entirely on their own in dead, calm air. Local stagehands have a rule. If you are working late into the night in the flylofts, 80 feet above the stage, and you feel a sudden freezing draft that smells like old copper and ozone, you don't look behind you. You simply pack up your tools and say, "Good night, Sam," and walk away. Because those who have turned around report seeing a tall, featureless silhouette standing on the narrow catwalk, staring down at the stage below, waiting for the next curtain call. When we look at a venue like the Moore Theater, we have to ask ourselves, what are we actually witnessing here? If you talk to mainstream skeptics, they'll point to the tangible. They'll tell you that the scent of James Moore's cigar is just an old tobacco resin trapped deep inside a century of plaster and lath, heating up when the building's ancient radiators kick in. They'll say the Victorian woman in the balcony is just an optical illusion. Shadows cast by street lights through the stained glass dome, and Stagehand Sam, just the natural settling of massive 120-year-old wooden grid system expanding and contracting in the Seattle draft. But to anyone who has stood backstage in the dead of night, those explanations feel hollow. Paranormal researchers often lean into two distinct theories for the Moore. The first is residual haunting, specifically the stone tape theory we mentioned earlier. Under this lens, the theater isn't actively occupied by thinking spirits. Instead, the intense emotional spikes, the grief of a displaced cemetery, the adrenaline of a performer, the roaring energy of thousands of grunge fans have been physically burned into the very materials of the building. The theater is acting like a projector, playing back a loop of history over and over again. But then, there is the second option, intelligent haunting. When the presence like Stagehand Sam physically detunes a guitar, or when a phantom scent anchors itself to one single chair and returns even after the fabric is replaced. That implies intent. It implies an awareness of the present. It suggests that some entities aren't just recordings. They are trapped in a loop of their own making, either because they refuse to leave the place they loved in life, or because they are bound to the earth by a final resting place that was violently taken away from them. Next time you find yourself in downtown Seattle, walking past the historic marquee of the Moore Theater, take a moment to look up at the upper tiers. And if you're lucky enough to catch a show there, sit back, enjoy the music, but pay attention to the air around you. If you catch the faint scent of premium tobacco, or feel a sudden icy draft cut through the crowd, don't brush it off. You might just be sharing your evening with a guest who bought their ticket over a century ago. Because the Moore Theater is a building that watches, not with eyes, not with intention, just with time. But not every haunting comes from the shadows inside a room. Some hauntings look out. A few blocks from here, there's a building covered in white terracotta, ornate, heavy, impossible to miss. It was built for men who chased gold, who came back changed, who carried stories they didn't always tell. And some of those men, according to the people who work there now, never really left. They're seen in the windows, in the hallways, in the reflections of the old glass, always dressed in white, always watching. Next time, we're stepping into the Arctic Club, a place where the past doesn't echo or whisper. It stands at the window and looks right back at you. Until then, stay curious, stay safe, and remember, some buildings just don't hold history. They keep it.